don't listen to DOE being wiped out. That won't happen. It's impossible.
This episode of the Student Housing Insight Podcast is sponsored by TheGuarantors. If you're an operator, you know the importance of a parental guarantor. Having parental guarantors legitimizes your rent roll. But have you ever tried collecting from a parental guarantor after their student skips out or they have to be evicted? How quickly were you able to recoup lost rent from that parental guarantor? The truth is, if things get to a point where a student skips out or is evicted for non-payment, the parental guarantor doesn't care about their credit score. There may have been a job loss or even a divorce. No background check is going to tell you which parent is about to leave their spouse or has an employer who is about to downsize. So how do you eliminate that risk? I mean, reducing risk is like the top 3 responsibilities of a property manager. Well, the Guarantor's rent coverage product does just that. Not only will it ensure that you can quickly recoup lost rent, but it will also increase your prospect to lease conversion rate because you're not waiting on a parent to provide their information. This product makes so much sense for student housing assets, and that's exactly why I'm now advising my asset management clients to forget about parental guarantors and talk to the Guarantors. You can find more information about their rent coverage product as well as other risk reduction products they provide to the student housing industry by going to theguarantors.com/student. You can also find the link in the show notes. Well, what's up, everyone, and welcome to the Student Housing Insight Podcast. I'm your host, Wesley Dees. I'm also the CEO of Student Housing Insight. If you've never heard of Student Housing Insight before, we are a platform for off-campus student housing professionals to network, share ideas, as well as data, and we produce some great content for the industry along the way. So you can find out more about our platform at studenthousinginsight.com. Again, that's studenthousinginsight.com. And don't worry if you're driving or you can't write that down. We provide all the links to everything that we talk about in the show notes, so you can go there to link to that later. In addition to this podcast, we also host the industry's monthly webinar called Shop Talk. Each month, we provide legislative and policy updates that are impacting our industry. Shop Talk also provides a monthly overview of pre-leasing data on a national and a regional basis, along with a panel of operators who provide their on-the-ground observations of how the pre-leasing season is going. And each month, we typically provide a topic of the month as well. So not every month, but most months. So a lot of great information. And if you are involved with the operations of student housing, specifically in the U.S., you should definitely register to receive our monthly invites. You can do that by going to our website at shoptalk.info. Again, that's shoptalk.info, and the link is going to be in the show notes. And just scroll down to the bottom and click on the link that says something along the lines of register to receive updates or something like that. So again, we'll provide that information in the show notes. So I'm recording this on November 18th, which is, 2 weeks ago. We had national elections here in the United States, and you guys all know the outcome, so I'm not going to recap that. This isn't a political podcast where I opine on the campaign and why a particular party won or lost. This is Student Housing Insight, so we're going to talk about or try to give you at least some insights on how that election or how those election results may end up impacting student housing specifically, but certainly the wider multifamily housing, rental housing in the United States. So if you tuned into our Shop Talk webinar back on November 14th, you've heard this interview that I'm about to play. So if you took notes and you just don't want to hear it again, congratulations, you just found an extra 30 minutes in your day. So you can go listen to another podcast or do something else. But for those that missed it, And those that want to, kind of go back and maybe hear a recap, this is a very important conversation between myself and Rich Kelly from Student Housing Business joined in on it as well, that we had with Dave Borzos from the National Multi-Housing Council in DC. For those that aren't aware of NMHC, they're somewhat of a lobbyist group for national multi-housing operators and owners. So that's, I guess, the easiest way to describe what they do. But fantastic organization, provides some great benefits to their members. If you're in this business and you haven't considered becoming a member of NMHC, definitely go check that out. I think you'll get a lot of great use out of the benefits that they provide. I certainly, have throughout my career, and they're fantastic to work with on this side of things as well. But with a new administration on the horizon and the balance of power in Congress, shifting, the regulatory and legislative landscape is really poised to change in this country. And so in this conversation, Dave provides a deep dive into the potential impacts on student housing, both from capital markets and agency appointments and deregulation, as well as immigration and federal policies in general. We'll also explore, some critical issues around the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the fate of bulk internet agreements, which is something that, if you've been listening to this podcast or tuning into Shop Talk, has been something that the Biden administration and the FCC have been toying around with, that would really have a huge impact on that for student housing. We're going to discuss that. We'll also talk about how tax and economic policies just might influence the industry in the months to come. So, very important episode. Please stay tuned to the end. So, if you're in the student housing industry and you're navigating today's uncertainties, this episode is certainly packed with a lot of insights to help you stay not only informed, but hopefully allow you to prepare. And so grab your notebook and let's jump in. Here's my conversation with Dave Borsos. We're going to jump in first to policy and legislative update. So let me bring up our good friend Dave Borzos from NMHC. Dave.
Wes.
Well, I think I kind of lost the bet because I didn't know that if we would get to the next Shop Talk, if we would actually know who the president-elect was. So we're we're there. We know who it is, and you've and because of that, you've deserved your own graphic today.
There we go. How about that? That may or may not be a good thing. I tend to agree with you. I think a lot of us thought we may not have known who was getting elected by this point in time, but clearly there was a mandate that was given by the people and who they voted for, et cetera. So, and I think today it's kind of been on and off, formally announced that the House has also gone to the Republicans. So they have a trifecta, which obviously makes any of the agenda for the incoming president a little bit easier to pass. I will tell you, in the past, just because a president has had both the House and the Senate didn't necessarily mean that they got everything passed. And that has happened whether they're Democrats or Republicans, including during the first administration with President Trump. He didn't get everything done you thought he would have gotten done. So with that in mind, I thought it would be a good time to at least just kind of give the people on the call a little bit of our thoughts in terms of what we think may be an impact to the student housing industry, because there's an awful lot of stuff going on. I don't expect that most of you on the call would watch and monitor all the appointments as closely as we do. That's kind of what our job is to do. Some of them have been relatively surprising so far, and remains to be seen what the impacts are. But and so far, all of the ones that have been appointed, quite honestly, have had projected little or no impact on our industry. That there's really kind of three appointments actually four that we would be looking for that we think has the most immediate impact. One would be who heads up Treasury, obviously, who heads up HUD, a little bit less of an impact on the student housing industry, but clearly still an issue, and who heads up the FHFA, who's the regulator of Fannie and Freddie, in addition, the Federal Home Loan Banks. And then two others of interest, CFPB, which has been kind of focused on fees and the term junk fees. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of what our expectations there potentially as well. And then the last one is the Department of Education and what impact potentially there, given that the president has said, I'm going to get rid of the Department of Education. So let me touch base. Let's start with kind of the impact to the capital markets. Obviously, our industry focuses on how do you get debt financing or financing for either construction or permanent financing for the buildings. And one of the larger providers of capital in the past has been Fannie and Freddie. In the prior Trump administration, he asked both HUD and Treasury to come up with reform plans. And Treasury was responsible for the reform plan of FHFA/Fannie and Freddie. And if we use that kind of as a little bit of a guide, on the positive side, they're talking about that they would still have Fannie and Freddie be able to finance multifamily. The downside in that particular plan is it said they could only do low and moderate income properties. So that's probably a negative that we're going to have to spend a lot of time with incoming people in FHFA and Treasury to ensure that that's not what happens, because that could have a negative impact on the ability for the industry to access debt. Clearly, Class A, new construction, et cetera, would all be impacted by that. So remains to be seen what can happen there. But going to FHFA and kind of Fannie and Freddie being under conservatorship since 2008, and that's a focus of the incoming administration. They've been talking to us about this even before the election. And what does that look like? One, if they could do nothing, they can continue to regulate, because Fannie and Freddie are in a much different position they were in 2008 than they are today. They don't have a balance sheet as much as they did. They can't do as many different types of products that they did before, and they actually have, quite honestly, they're halfway to the capital that they would need to be able to release from conservatorship. So, a lot of the things have been positively impacted in terms of getting in that direction. To release from conservatorship, you have to have a negotiation between FHFA and Treasury. That's why, since they haven't named either one of those, clearly something that we're following. Does not involve Congress. They could negotiate between the two of them and they could release from conservatorship. That may be the most obvious thing that occurs. Then it would, in many ways, kind of look like what Fannie and Freddie were before. And then the last component would be if they really undertake a complete rethinking of what those enterprises do and what their business models are, that would involve Congress and way more complex, way more difficult. So if I were to put betting money on release from conservatorship, kind of everything somewhat stays the same, other than we're going to be watching to make sure that we don't get cut out of that. So with that in mind, one of the other things that we would highly expect, and I think both from a front end perspective, but especially on kind of the operational side, deregulation. In the last Trump administration, they had a mandate that for every new regulation, they'd have to get rid of two. And so we expect something similar in that regard. And so, one, we would expect that new regulation issuance is going to dramatically slow down. And quite honestly, between now and January, when new administration comes in, I wouldn't expect anything major to occur. So a lot of that will slow down. And quite honestly, even if there has been a regulation put in place, if the incoming administration doesn't support it, they can slow it down. They can defund. There's any number of different ways instead of absolutely getting rid of stuff. So I would certainly expect that we will see some rollback of regulations. Some of them may be regarding EPA, which put out a lot of appliance proposed rules for which have a dramatic impact on our industry in terms of kind of updated appliances, et cetera. We think a lot of that, which we have been issuing a huge number of comment letters to the current administration's EPA efforts, we think a lot of that will be rolled back. So there'll be a net positive for the industry as it pertains to what we think may be impacts on what appliances you have to buy and replace, et cetera. So it's something I think is critically important for us to watch, and I think it'll be a positive development. As it pertains to the Department of Education, I know the president said he's going to get rid of it, but there's actually not an ability to eliminate the Department of Education. You have to get a supermajority in Senate. If 60 votes to do that, it's just not going to happen. So what can you do? You can fund it less. You can ask them to do less than what they've been asked, and fewer regulations, et cetera. So there'll still be an administration of student loans and other things of that nature, which are critical to our industry. I don't think that's going to go away, but other types of initiatives that may not be viewed favorably by the incoming administration will be slow walked or resources shifted away from it. Their definitions of thing that may be woke, using their terminology, you're not going to see a lot of that being pushed. It's going to be much more administratively, which would be, from our perspective, in order to continue to get students loans, is going to be a positive impact for our industry. So don't listen to DOE being wiped out. That won't happen. It's impossible. Immigration, clearly a big focus, and I would expect that certainly will get a lot more funding and a lot more focus. As it pertains to labor impacts, et cetera, realistically, are people hiring illegal immigrants? The answer is probably yes in certain situations. I guess the part that has certainly been talked about a lot, and we really don't know at this particular point in time, will there be deportation? We just don't know the answer to that. But legal immigration, access to certain categories through like H-1B visas is probably also going to be slowed down. So to that end, access to labor, which I think is already an issue for our industry, may be impacted by some of the changes in immigrations, et cetera. So overall, in terms of regulations, in terms of things that have been pushed out in the past through the SEC, through the banking regulators, through technology in terms of AI, all of those, in many ways, we think are going to be any of those regulations, which quite honestly, we were pushing back on, maybe a favorable light here in terms of pushing back on some of the regulations that were potentially negatively impacting that. I think a lot of people have been worried about the use of algorithms, et cetera, and the Department of Justice being part of lawsuits. We think there's going to be a shift in what the Department of Justice is going to go after, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that will go away, because the most recent lawsuit that was filed this year with the DOJ had 8 states that filed them along with the DOJ. So what may happen is that we're going to see more state level pushing as opposed to federal level pushing. So stay tuned there. I think some things will lighten up from a federal perspective, but won't necessarily take the pressure off from some of the states who are continue to actively pursue that. And then, with that in mind, I think, you're going to have to keep a pulse on what state and localities have been thinking about as it pertains to certain types of regulations that they may be in control of, given that they may not get the support of the federal government, but they may be pushing forward on that. So, again, while positive from a federal perspective, we may see some continued push from the state and localities. And the last thing is that overall, and this is a Washington, D.C. impact more than anything else probably, is that there may be some downsizing in the federal government, whether it impacts our industries with those variety of agencies that I've mentioned, remains to be seen. The ability to downsize, remove federal employees that are not politically appointed is a little bit more difficult than it is the political appointees. So that may be a little bit more of a talk and a bluster to say that, but it really may not result in anything that we see dramatic shifts and downsizing of the federal government. So I told Wes I'd talk a little bit longer because you had a little bit extra time. Happy to answer any questions if people have any concerns. Certainly willing to take any questions from anybody at this point.
I want to go back really quick to the immigration thing, kind of asking the reverse of it, because throughout the cycle, I've heard Trump talk about wanting to actually increase F1 visas, which for international recruitment of students, that would be a big thing. But I don't know how real. I mean, is that just like I said, you may not know the answer to this, but is that something that he can do by just giving the director of DOE the goal of doing that, or is that something that
Yeah.
actually has to go through some type of process?
No, I mean, it's a great question, and there's an awful lot of processes that exist here in DC in terms of what you can or can't do. Whether it's executive action, whether it's administratively through an agency. So they could actually do that without any input from Congress. So
Gotcha.
To the degree that they want to dial one of those up or down, they can certainly do that.
Gotcha. Any other kind of signals that we should be looking at, especially when it comes to some of the pullback on, be it the regulations or, going back to what you were talking about with, I know there's some back and forth about who may be leading the Fed, but are there any signals there that we should kind of be looking out for that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because we don't know who's in place there yet, and so it's a little bit harder to kind of get that sense. I mean, think about the major exit poll question and issue that people had, and it had to do with economy, right? And whether it's the price of bread and eggs, or whether it's just in general feeling about the economy, the big focus for the incoming administration is how do I impact the economy in a positive way. So part of that may have to do with interest rates, right? Front end of the curve, which is when we wait for Chairman Powell out of the Fed to kind of lower rates, which we did just right after the election. That's just the floating rate front side of the curve. The 10-year, which is kind of if you're going to get, whether it's a single family mortgage or whether it's a multifamily mortgage, that longer end of the curve is where things are typically priced off of. And the government, without any type of intervention, typically has no impact on that whatsoever. And if you look at it, the 10-year has gone way up since the election, right? And so if there's anything that he would ask the Fed to do, it would be to increase the balance sheet of the Fed by buying Treasury, their own paper and others, to drive down the interest rates on the longer end of the curve. And that could be a positive for everybody. It lowers mortgage rates for both single family and multifamily. That would certainly be a plus. That certainly is something that I think they're going to be focused on. The other things from an economy perspective, like immigration, I know people have that as an issue, but that has no impact on what you're paying at the grocery store. And so the other question becomes, is there any way to look at lowering gas prices, right? And if you think about where we were during the first Trump administration, there were some things that he had negotiations with the Saudis and the Russians that actually lowered some of the gas prices. So that's another one. So I think, signaling to the broader economy and the average person is I'm driving down your borrowing costs and mortgages. I'm going to lower gas prices, and then can he has an impact on food prices in any way? And I haven't heard enough yet about whether that would be something that he could impact.
Well, and I brought on Rich a little bit earlier. We're gonna talk about LeaseCon TurnCon in just a second, but Rich, not to put you on the spot, but obviously,
but he's going to.
Yeah, I'm going to. But obviously, running student housing business, you guys are covering a lot of these legislative policies. I'm sure you guys may have some questions. So I want to give you the opportunity to put something in front of Dave that maybe the rest of us aren't thinking about?
Whew, that's tough. I don't want to put Dave too much on the spot either, but I guess I would say, Dave, net, and I realize it's really hard to project, but do you think this administration will be better for the commercial real estate, multifamily, and student housing industries than a Harris administration would have been?
It's a good question. I think there's going to be some positive things for the industry. Look, one of the things, if you think about from what our role is at NMHC, is to understand and look at regulations, legislation that impacts our industry. And there have been a lot of regulations that were put forth during the Biden administration, which we viewed unfavorably, and may get some positive results from that. On the same note, there's some other things like that while the IRA was a huge thing, it created a lot of jobs. There's a lot of manufacturing jobs. So and a lot of that money has been spent. Plus, a lot of it went to our businesses where people were upgrading properties and had access to money to make them more energy efficient, et cetera, which goes to our bottom line. So, I don't think that the incoming administration is very supportive of that, but they may look at it and go, okay, I'm going to leave that in place. They probably wouldn't have done that on their own, but it's certainly some positive. So there's some give and take there. The one thing I didn't mention, by the way, is taxes. And that's a big focus for us. And the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017 expires next year. So big focus for us because it has an impact on the industry and impact on people individually. That one's not going to be that easy because I think some of the new incoming administration want to dramatically lower interest, the tax rates even more. But I think there's some others who are like, well, wait a second, we're just going to dramatically add to the deficit. So that one's going to be an interesting play. If there had been a split House and Senate, you would have had what I call a more balanced negotiation. So I think it could be positive, but there's some things that are landmines in there that people could pay for things that could be a negative to our industry, right? They have to, we're going to cut this, we're going to cut this tax rate, but we're going to take away this over here because that actually helps pay for it. That could be detrimental. We have our finger and pulse on some of those things. It's not worth getting into them right now, but there are some aspects there. The one last thing, which I do have quite honestly a big concern is, and that's ending conservatorship. And that says releasing Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship. There's no upside to that, right? And I would bet I could sit down with a group of people on this call. Most people like, what does that even mean and who cares, right? So if they get that done, it's going to be a big, who cares that you got them out of conservatorship? It's been working okay. We have access to mortgages. And to the degree you do anything to the negative of that, if you raise interest rates, you make it harder to get a mortgage, that's a net negative. And so, there's only downside risk in doing that. But they started talking to us about this months ago, and it's something that they're focused on. And I just, in the back of my mind, I have a concern that just to get it done, we hope that it's not just that, but it's something more constructive with the idea there that at minimum it leaves the marketplace neutral to what it was before.
Well, Dave, I've just got one last question, and that's the, some of the things that we saw with the FCC that the Biden administration was pushing on them that was going to have a heavy impact on being able to offer the bulk internet agreements.
Yeah.
You think that's in the grave at this point?
Yes, I
Perfect.
do. Good. Right, because that wasn't a final rule, it was proposed, and even if they finalized it next week or something, there's something called the Congressional Review Act that they can look back 60 days and Congress can vote on it and say, we don't agree with that rule, and they eliminate it, and that agency can never propose that rule again. So
gotcha.
There's just nothing going to get done before the new administration gets sworn in, and that rule is not going to happen. So
great.
A net positive for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dave, thanks so much for the extra time, and of course all the value that NMHC brings to us. You guys provided at the Student Housing Conference back in October, kind of a preview of both sides of, depending on which administration, as well as many of the Congress members that they got in, things to be prepared for. I don't think it swing any votes one way or another, but I think it definitely, if you're a member of NMHC or you attended, I would definitely log in and download that PDF presentation, because it provides a little bit of a roadmap of some things to expect. So thanks for all the work that you guys are doing, and we'll see you next month. Again, a big thanks to Dave for all of his time in recording that, and the time that he gives each month for our Shop Talk webinars. And I appreciate Rich allowing me to really kind of put him on the spot in a lot of ways. And guys, again, if you're not subscribed to Shop Talk, you need to be, so you can get this great insight on topics like this, as well as a lot of the other things that we cover. Make sure you go to shoptalk.info, and as I mentioned earlier, just scroll down or click in the menu to register to receive Shop Talk notifications. And our next one is coming up on November 19th, so make sure that's on your calendars as well. And one other thing I just want to mention, be it Shop Talk or anything else, you can always go to our website, studenthousinginsight.com, and click on the events tab, and all of those events that we're a part of, as well as a lot of industry events that we just like supporting, are going to be there as well. Well, hey, that's going to do it for today's episode. Speaking of events, I will be at LeaseCon TurnCon. That is happening in Charlotte on December 9th and 10th. If you're going to be at that conference, make sure that I get a chance to say hello and that we speak, and let me know that you've been listening to the podcast. I love hearing that from folks. And again, LeaseCon TurnCon, as well as other events that we're involved in, you can find out more info if you don't have the links from other sources. You can always go to studenthousinginsight.com and click on the events tab. Guys, thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next one.